The Tonight Show studio hummed with its familiar Friday night energy as Carlos Rivera walked onto the stage, his weathered hands clasped nervously in front of him, and his kind eyes taking in the bright lights with quiet amazement. At 58, Carlos moved with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had spent decades walking hospital corridors during the darkest hours of the night, his presence radiating a calm dignity that seemed to settle over the studio like a gentle blanket. Jimmy Fallon stood to greet him, immediately struck by Carlos's humble demeanor and the way he seemed both honored and slightly overwhelmed to be there. Carlos wore his best navy blue shirt and pressed khakis, clothes that were clearly reserved for special occasions, and carried a worn canvas messenger bag that had obviously seen years of faithful service during countless night shifts. "Carlos Rivera, everyone," Jimmy announced as the audience applauded warmly. "Carlos just retired after 25 years working night security at St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago. Carlos, welcome to the Tonight Show." Carlos settled into the guest chair with a gentle smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way that comes from decades of offering comfort to people in their most vulnerable moments. "Thank you for having me, Jimmy. I have to say, this is a lot brighter than my usual Friday night routine of walking empty hospital hallways." The audience chuckled, and Jimmy leaned forward with genuine interest. 25 years of night security at a hospital, that must have given you some incredible perspectives on life. What was that experience like? Carlos's expression grew thoughtful, and he placed his hands on the messenger bag in his lap. "You know, Jimmy, most people think security work is pretty straightforward. Watch the doors, monitor the cameras, make sure everything stays safe and secure. And that was part of my job, certainly. But working nights at a hospital, that's a different kind of environment entirely." "How so?" Jimmy asked, sensing there was something deeper behind Carlos's words. Carlos was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "When you work at a hospital during the day, you see a lot of activity. Doctors rushing around, nurses managing their rounds, families visiting. But at night, especially in the late hours, the hospital becomes a different place entirely. It becomes quieter, more intimate, and that's when you really see the human side of medicine." The studio grew attentive, the audience picking up on the sincerity and depth in Carlos's voice. Jimmy settled back in his chair, giving Carlos space to share his story. "During my night rounds, I'd walk past the family waiting areas and I'd see people in some of the most difficult moments of their lives." Carlos continued, his voice taking on a softer quality. "Parents whose children were in surgery, spouses waiting for news about their loved ones, families who had driven hours to be at the bedside of someone they cared about." Carlos's eyes grew distant as he recalled those countless nights. "What struck me most was how alone these people often were, not just physically alone, though many were sitting by themselves at 2 or 3 in the morning, but emotionally alone, scared, worried, carrying burdens they didn't know how to share with anyone." Jimmy felt a chill of recognition, understanding that this was leading somewhere profound. That must have been difficult to witness night after night. Carlos nodded slowly. "It was. But about 5 years into my job, something happened that changed everything for me. I was doing my midnight rounds when I found this young woman, maybe early 20s, sitting in the surgical waiting area. She was crying quietly, holding a crumpled tissue and staring at the floor. The audience listened in respectful silence, sensing they were about to hear something important. I asked if she was okay, if there was anything I could do to help. She looked up at me and said her husband had been in a motorcycle accident. He was in emergency surgery, and she was alone because her family lived across the country. She had been sitting there for 6 hours with no news, no support, just fear." Carlos's voice grew more emotional as he continued. "I sat with her for a few minutes, just listened while she talked about her husband, about how scared she was, about how helpless she felt. When I had to continue my rounds, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Here was this young woman facing one of the worst nights of her life, and she was completely alone. Jimmy leaned forward, completely absorbed in Carlos's story. "What did you do?" Carlos reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. I went back to my security office and I wrote her a letter. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just a few paragraphs letting her know that someone was thinking about her, that someone cared about what she was going through, that she wasn't as alone as she felt. He opened the notebook, revealing pages filled with careful handwriting. I left it on the table next to where she was sitting with a note that just said, "From someone who cares." I never signed my name, never identified myself. I just wanted her to know that in this big, scary hospital, someone had noticed her pain and wanted to offer comfort. The studio was completely quiet now, everyone hanging on Carlos's words. Jimmy felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. "What happened after that?" Jimmy asked gently. Carlos smiled, an expression filled with both sadness and joy. The next morning, when my shift ended, I walked by the waiting area one more time. The woman was gone, but there was a note left on the table where I had placed my letter. It just said, "Thank you for reminding me that angels work night shifts too. My husband is going to be okay, and knowing someone cared helped me get through the darkest hours." Jimmy wiped his eyes, no longer caring about maintaining his composure on national television. "Carlos, that's beautiful, but I have a feeling this wasn't just a one-time thing." Carlos's face lit up with quiet pride. "You're right, Jimmy. That night changed everything for me. I realized that my job wasn't just about security. I was in a unique position to notice people who were struggling, who were alone, who needed to know that someone cared about their pain." He held up the worn notebook. "I started keeping track of the people I encountered during my rounds who seemed to need extra support. People sitting alone in waiting rooms, families who looked overwhelmed, individuals who seemed lost or scared. And I began writing letters." Jimmy looked at the notebook with amazement. "How many letters are we talking about, Carlos?" Carlos considered the question carefully. "Over 20 years, I'd estimate I wrote somewhere between 800 and 1,000 letters. Some were short notes of encouragement. Others were longer letters sharing hope or comfort. Each one was tailored to the specific person and situation I had observed." The studio audience began to murmur in amazement, and Jimmy felt a profound sense of awe. "Carlos, are you telling us that for 20 years you've been secretly providing comfort to people in their darkest moments?" "I prefer to think of it as being a good neighbor," Carlos replied with humility. These people were in crisis, often far from home dealing with medical emergencies or loss. If a simple letter could remind them that someone cared, that someone had noticed their struggle, then writing those letters was the least I could do. Jimmy shook his head in wonder. "What kinds of things would you write about?" Carlos opened his notebook and found a section near the beginning. I kept copies of some of the letters, just so I could remember what I had written. Here's one I wrote to a father whose teenage son had been in a car accident. He cleared his throat and began to read. "Dear worried father, I don't know your name, but I've watched you pace these halls for 2 days, holding vigil for your son. I see the love in your eyes, the fear in your shoulders, the way you haven't eaten because your stomach is tied in knots. I want you to know that your son is lucky to have a father who loves him so deeply. Whatever happens, that love is going to carry both of you through this. You're not alone, even when it feels like you are, from someone who cares." The audience was openly moved now, many wiping away tears. Jimmy felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Carlos, how did you decide what to write? How did you know what people needed to hear?" Carlos's expression grew more thoughtful. "You know, Jimmy, after years of watching people in crisis, You start to recognize certain patterns. Most people in hospitals aren't just dealing with medical issues, they're dealing with fear, loneliness, uncertainty about the future. They're often far from their support systems, trying to be strong for their loved ones while falling apart inside. He flipped through more pages of his notebook. What I learned is that people don't necessarily need answers or solutions. Most of the time, they just need to know that someone sees them, someone recognizes their pain, someone cares enough to acknowledge what they're going through. Jimmy leaned forward with deep respect. Did you ever reveal your identity? Did anyone ever figure out it was you writing these letters? Carlos smiled with a mixture of pride and humility. That was the whole point. I never wanted recognition or thanks. I wanted the letters to be pure gifts without any expectation of response or acknowledgement. Hope doesn't need a name attached to it. It just needs to arrive when people need it most. He paused, then continued. Although I will say that over the years, I would sometimes overhear conversations about the letters. Families talking about the mysterious notes they had received, wondering who had been kind enough to reach out during their difficult time. Those conversations always reminded me that small acts of kindness can have ripple effects we never fully see. Jimmy turned to address the camera directly. Ladies and gentlemen, we're sitting here with a man who has been a secret guardian angel for 20 years, providing comfort to thousands of people during their most vulnerable moments. Carlos looked slightly uncomfortable with the praise. Jimmy, I think you're making this sound more dramatic than it really was. I was already walking through the hospital every night anyway. It just made sense to pay attention to the people I encountered and offer support when I could. But Carlos, Jimmy pressed gently, most people wouldn't have noticed those details. Most people wouldn't have taken the time to write personalized letters. And most people certainly wouldn't have kept it up for 20 years without any recognition. Carlos was quiet for a moment, then reached into his messenger bag again and pulled out a small box filled with folded papers. Actually, Jimmy, I did get recognition, the most meaningful kind of recognition possible. He held up the box. These are responses I found over the years. People would sometimes leave thank you notes in the areas where I had left my letters, not knowing who had written them, but wanting to express their gratitude anyway. Carlos selected one of the folded papers and opened it carefully. This one is from a woman whose mother was dying of cancer. She wrote, "To whoever left the beautiful letter by my mother's bedside, thank you for reminding me that love transcends understanding and that sometimes strangers care in ways that family members forget how to. Your words helped me find the strength to say goodbye." Jimmy wiped his eyes again, deeply moved by the profound impact of Carlos's quiet ministry. Carlos, do you realize what you've done? You've basically been providing emotional and spiritual care to people who needed it most. Carlos nodded, tears beginning to form in his own eyes. I realized something over the years, Jimmy. Hospitals are places where people confront their deepest fears. Fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of the unknown, but they're also places where love shows up in its purest form. I saw families supporting each other, strangers helping strangers, medical staff going above and beyond their duties to provide comfort. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. I wanted to be part of that love, part of that support system. My letters were just one small way of adding to the network of care that exists in every hospital, often invisibly, always powerfully. The audience began to applaud, but it was different from typical television applause. This was the sound of people recognizing something genuinely beautiful, something that restored their faith in human compassion. Tell me about your last night at the hospital, Jimmy said. What was that like? Knowing it was the end of this incredible mission? Carlos's expression grew bittersweet. My last night was about a month ago. I have to admit I was emotional about leaving. not just because I was ending my career, but because I was wondering who would notice the people who needed extra support, who would be there to offer comfort during those long, dark hours. He paused, then smiled with obvious warmth. But you know what I realized on my last night? Over 20 years, I had been modeling something important. I had been showing that it's possible to care about strangers, to notice pain and respond to it, to be present for people even when they don't know your name. Jimmy leaned forward with interest. What do you mean? I mean that during my final rounds, I noticed other hospital staff, nurses, janitors, volunteers, leaving their own small notes of encouragement for patients and families. The culture of caring had spread beyond my letters. People had learned to pay attention differently, to see opportunities for kindness that they might have missed before. Carlos's voice grew more emotional. I realized that I hadn't just been writing letters for 20 years. I had been teaching by example that everyone who works in a hospital, everyone who encounters people in crisis has the opportunity to be a source of comfort and hope. The studio was completely silent now. Everyone absorbed in Carlos's profound realization. Jimmy felt like he was in the presence of someone who had discovered one of life's most important truths. Carlos, Jimmy said softly, what would you say to people watching this who want to make a difference, but feel like they don't have the platform or opportunity to help others? Carlos looked directly into the camera, his expression serious but filled with love. I'd say that you don't need a title or a uniform or special training to be a source of comfort for other people. You just need to pay attention to the suffering around you and be willing to respond with kindness. He held up his worn notebook again. This isn't sophisticated technology or a complicated system. This is just one person deciding to notice when other people are hurting and choosing to respond with love. Anyone can do this, anywhere. Carlos's voice grew more passionate. Every day, all of us encounter people who are struggling. At work, at the grocery store, in our neighborhoods, online. If we just pay attention, if we just care enough to notice when someone needs encouragement, we can all be the person who reminds someone that they're not alone. Jimmy nodded, profoundly moved by Carlos's words. What's next for you, Carlos? Now that you're retired? Carlos smiled with obvious excitement. Well, I'm not done writing letters, if that's what you're asking. I've started volunteering with a local hospice organization, and I'm also working with grief support groups. There are always people who need to know that someone cares about their pain. Jimmy turned to address the studio audience. Ladies and gentlemen, Carlos Rivera just taught us something incredibly important. Heroism isn't always dramatic or visible. Sometimes it's as simple as noticing someone's pain and choosing to respond with love, even when no one will ever know it was you. As the segment continued, Carlos shared more stories of the letters he had written and the responses he had received. He talked about the time he helped coordinate support for a family whose child was having experimental surgery, organizing anonymous meals and encouragement from the entire hospital community. He described the network of night shift workers who had begun leaving their own small tokens of support for patients and families, inspired by the example he had set. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, Carlos didn't immediately leave the stage. He sat with Jimmy for another hour, sharing more stories and talking about his philosophy of anonymous kindness. Jimmy nodded, deeply moved by his conversation with Carlos. You've certainly changed my perspective on what it means to care for others. In the weeks following Carlos's appearance, something remarkable happened. Hospitals across the country began receiving reports of similar anonymous letters appearing in waiting rooms, and patient areas The Tonight Show received hundreds of emails from viewers sharing their own stories of small kindnesses they had offered to strangers in need. Security guards, hospital workers, and night shift employees began implementing their own versions of Carlos's system, paying attention to people in crisis and finding ways to offer comfort and support The movement that had started with one man's notebook had spread to thousands of people choosing to notice and respond to suffering with love. Carlos's story sparked a national conversation about the importance of anonymous kindness and the power that ordinary people have to provide extraordinary comfort during difficult times.